The lonely widow took in a stray dog on a night when the rain seemed determined to wash away what little hope remained in her heart. Margaret Foster stood at her kitchen window, watching droplets race down the glass, each one a reminder of tears she'd shed since Robert's passing 3 years ago. The empty house on Willow Lane had once echoed with laughter and light. Now it was just hollow spaces and memories that refused to fade. Outside, huddled beneath the old oak tree, a scraggly mutt with matted fur stared at her window. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. Two souls, equally lost. Something in that gaze reminded Margaret of herself. Abandoned, forgotten, surviving rather than living. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pulling her cardigan tighter. At 67, Margaret wasn't in the habit of making impulsive decisions. Her daughter Emma called her meticulously cautious during their monthly phone calls from across the country, calls that had grown shorter and less frequent with each passing season. Yet here she was, opening her back door to the downpour, a bowl of leftover stew in hand. "Come on then," she called, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "I don't have all night." The dog didn't move at first, suspicion evident in its hunched posture. Margaret recognized that wariness, the fear that any offered kindness might be yanked away. She'd felt it herself at every widow's support group she'd abandoned, every neighborhood invitation she'd declined. "It's just us, you and me," she said softly. "No one else to disappoint." The dog limped forward, revealing a badly injured paw. Its coat, what might have once been golden, was now a muddy brown, clumped and dirty. But its eyes, amber and intelligent, held Margaret's gaze without flinching. It took 20 minutes of patience before the dog would eat from the bowl while Margaret remained on the porch. Another hour passed before she managed to coax it into the mudroom with an old blanket. As she closed the door between them, the dog in the mudroom, Margaret in her kitchen, she felt something strange. A reason to wake up tomorrow. Just until the storm passes, she told herself, washing the food bowl with unnecessary precision. Nothing permanent. Morning arrived with tentative sunshine and the realization that Margaret had slept through the night for the first time in months. No 3 a.m. wandering through silent rooms. No rereading old cards or touching Robert's shirts that no longer smelled like him. The dog was still there, curled tight on the blanket, watching her with those amber eyes. "You need a bath and a vet," she announced, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "And I suppose you need a name too." The dog's tail gave one tentative thump against the blanket. Margaret had forgotten how exhausting hope could be. The trip to the veterinarian left her drained, the forms to fill out, the concerned looks from Dr. Parker as he examined the dog's injured paw and malnourished frame, the decision-making about treatments and costs. "She's about 4 years old, a golden retriever mix." "Doctor?" Parker explained, gently cleaning a cut on the dog's ear. "She's been on her own for some time, but she was someone's pet once. No microchip, though." "I'm not keeping her," Margaret said quickly. "I just found her in the storm." "Doctor." Parker's smile was kind but knowing. "Of course. We can check with local shelters if anyone's looking for her." No one was looking, as Margaret had somehow known would be the case. She named the dog Sunny, not for her bedraggled coat, but for the way Margaret felt when those amber eyes locked onto hers, like a ray of warmth breaking through clouds that had hung overhead for far too long. The days that followed took on a rhythm Margaret hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Mornings began with Sunny's gentle whine for breakfast and a slow walk around the block. Afternoons found them in the neglected garden where Margaret had once tended roses with careful precision. Evenings were spent with Sunny's head in her lap, the television murmuring in the background while Margaret read books she'd purchased but never opened. "Mom, you got a dog?" Emma's voice crackled with surprise during their next call. "By yourself?" There was a note in her daughter's tone that Margaret recognized, the same one Emma used when she discovered her mother had forgotten to pay a bill or had eaten the same soup 3 days running. Concern tinged with something else. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Sunny found me, actually," Margaret replied, watching the dog snooze in the patch of light from the window. "She needed help." That's good, I guess. "As long as it's not too much for you." "Dogs are a lot of work." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. "I managed to raise you and your brother while working full-time after your father left. I think I can handle feeding a dog." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Emma had never understood why Margaret had remarried after her father abandoned them, why she'd chosen quiet, steadfast Robert, who worked with his hands and spoke little. Emma had been 17 then, already planning her escape to college and a life far from their small town. She'd tolerated Robert but never embraced him as family. "How is Jason?" Margaret asked, changing the subject to her grandson, Emma's 6-year-old son whom Margaret had met only twice. "Busy with school?" "Listen, Mom, I should go. Work is crazy this month. I'll call soon, okay?" Margaret set the phone down and looked at Sunny, who had opened her eyes and was watching with that steady, unflinching gaze. "She means well," Margaret told the dog, who thumped her tail in response. "They all mean well." It was a Wednesday when Sunny changed everything. The dog had been with Margaret for nearly a month, her coat now gleaming gold, her limp almost gone. They had extended their morning walks, venturing beyond the familiar blocks of the neighborhood to the small wooded area that bordered the creek. Sunny stopped suddenly, her nose working overtime, and then bolted toward a thicket of overgrown bushes. "Sunny, come back!" Margaret called, her heart racing. The dog had never disobeyed before. Following as quickly as her knees would allow, Margaret pushed through brambles until she found Sunny pawing excitedly at what appeared to be an old fallen tree. But as Margaret drew closer, she realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was the rotted remains of an old rowboat, half buried in years of accumulated soil and leaves. "What on earth?" Margaret murmured, reaching to grab Sunny's collar. "Come on, girl. There's nothing here." But Sunny whined and pulled away, continuing to dig at a specific spot near what would have been the boat's stern. With a sigh, Margaret knelt beside her, wincing at the twinge in her back. "You're going to be the death of my washing machine," she told the dog, whose paws were now thick with mud. "What are you looking for anyway?" That's when her fingers brushed against something solid beneath the soil. Metal, not wood, square-edged and sturdy. 20 minutes later, Margaret sat on a nearby log, staring at a mud-covered metal box about the size of a small suitcase. It had a simple latch but no lock, though years of exposure had rusted it shut. Sunny sat beside her, panting happily as if she'd completed an important task. "This is probably just some old fishing gear," Margaret told the dog, "or trash someone dumped." But something about the box's weight and the careful way it had been hidden made her doubt her own words. With effort, she carried it home, Sunny trotting proudly at her side. The box sat on Margaret's kitchen table for 2 days before she worked up the courage to force the latch open with a screwdriver and hammer. When the lid finally creaked upward, she gasped. Inside, protected by a layer of waxed canvas, lay bundles of old letters tied with faded ribbon, several small jewelry boxes, a stack of photographs, and beneath it all, a leather-bound journal. On top was a sealed envelope with a single word written in elegant script, "Willow." Margaret's hands trembled. Willow Lane, her street, her house. The journal belonged to Eleanor Winters, according to the inscription on the first page. Dated 1952, the entries told the story of a young woman who had come to town to teach at the local school, taking residence in a small cottage on Willow Lane, Margaret's house, though it had been expanded since then. As Margaret read through the journal over the next several days, a remarkable story unfolded. Eleanor had fallen in love with a young man named James Hayes, whose family disapproved of the match due to Eleanor's humble background. They had planned to elope, with James promising to return with enough money for them to start a new life elsewhere. The last entry, dated October 15, 1953, read simply, "He hasn't come. 3 months now. I can wait no longer. What I carry with me is too precious to risk." The photographs showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly into Margaret's soul. Several showed her with a tall young man, their happiness evident even across the decades. The jewelry boxes contained a modest diamond ring, a pearl necklace, and most surprisingly, 3 gold coins dated 1850 that Margaret suspected might be valuable. But it was the sealed letter addressed to Willow that finally made her reach for the phone. "Emma, it's Mom. I need to ask you something important." 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in her living room, now crowded with people she'd invited into her home for the first time in years. Emma was there with Jason, having flown in after Margaret had explained her discovery. Dr. Parker had come as well, along with a local historian, Judith Mills, who specialized in the town's past. Most significantly, there was Catherine Hayes, an elderly woman of 89, who sat in Margaret's best armchair with tears streaming down her lined face. "My father never spoke of her," Catherine said, holding Eleanor's journal with trembling hands. "He married my mother in 1955, but there was always a sadness about him. He would sometimes go walking by himself, down by the creek. Now I understand why." The historian filled in the gaps. James Hayes had indeed left town in 1953, sent away by his family to work in their business interests in another state. Letters revealed he had written to Eleanor many times, but his family had intercepted the correspondence. By the time he returned, nearly a year later, Eleanor had disappeared. "She was pregnant," Margaret said softly, thinking of the journal's last entry, "and she left to protect her child." Catherine nodded slowly. "Which means I may have a half-sibling somewhere. A brother or sister I never knew existed." The gold coins turned out to be rare California gold rush specimens, worth considerably more than anyone had expected, nearly $30,000 each. The discovery made local news with the headline, "Widow's Dog Uncovers Historical Treasure." But the true treasure wasn't the monetary value of the coins. It was the connections being rebuilt in Margaret's life. Emma stayed for 2 weeks, longer than any visit since Robert's funeral. Margaret watched her daughter playing with Jason in the backyard, Sunny racing circles around them, and felt something unfurl in her chest, a lightness she had forgotten was possible. "You know," Emma said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, "I've been thinking about moving back here." Margaret nearly spilled her tea. "What?" "Your job, I can work remotely. My company's been shifting that way anyway since the pandemic." Emma was watching Jason throw a ball for Sunny, and looking at all those old letters, those people who lost their chances. It makes you think about what matters. Margaret didn't trust herself to speak. She reached for her daughter's hand instead. With Catherine's blessing, Margaret used some of the money from the gold coins to establish a scholarship in Eleanor Winter's name at the local community college. The remainder she split, putting some aside for Jason's education and using the rest to renovate her house. Not just basic repairs, but transforming it into the warm, welcoming space it had once been. The most meaningful project, however, was the search for Eleanor's child. Working with a genealogist and using DNA testing, they discovered that Eleanor had given birth to a daughter named Mary, who had been raised in a city 200 miles away. Mary had passed away in 2010, but she had children and grandchildren, one of whom, a woman named Grace, lived just an hour's drive from Margaret. 6 months after Sunny had dug up the metal box, Margaret's dining room table was surrounded by people who were strangers and family all at once: Emma and Jason, Catherine Hayes and her son, Grace and her teenage daughter Lily, who had Eleanor's dark eyes, and Dr. Parker, whose first name was David, and who had taken to calling Margaret regularly to check on Sunny. Sunny herself lay contentedly under the table, accepting scraps and pets from everyone. Occasionally she would look up at Margaret with those knowing amber eyes, as if to say, "See what I found for you?" Not just treasure, family. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet than before, Margaret sat on her porch with Sunny at her feet. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to the dog. "Somehow you knew exactly what was buried there. Exactly what I needed." Sunny rested her head on Margaret's knee and sighed contentedly. The story of the lonely widow who took in a stray dog spread throughout the town and beyond. Local news covered the historical significance of the find, and the community embraced the tale of Eleanor and James as part of their heritage. But few understood the true transformation that had occurred within the walls of the house on Willow Lane. Margaret's days were no longer measured in empty hours, but in moments of connection. Jason's weekly video calls to tell her about school, planning sessions with Catherine for the Eleanor Winters Memorial Garden they were creating at the town library, coffee with David Parker that gradually, tenderly evolved into dinner dates, and long walks with Sunny, who still occasionally stopped to dig in interesting spots, though she never again uncovered anything more significant than an exceptionally appealing stick. 1 year to the day after that rainy night when Margaret had first opened her door to a bedraggled stray, she sat at her kitchen table writing in a journal of her own. Emma and Jason were arriving tomorrow to spend the summer. The guest room was ready, and the garden was blooming with new life. "The treasure wasn't in the box," she wrote. "It was in what the box represented, second chances. Eleanor never got hers with James, but she's given all of us ours. One act of kindness on a rainy night, letting in a stray who needed shelter, somehow connected all these broken pieces into something whole again. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Rain began to tap against the window panes. Margaret looked up to see Sunny watching her from her new plush bed in the corner, those amber eyes filled with contentment. "Come on, girl," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "Let's go sit on the porch and watch the storm together." As they settled on the porch swing, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. "Still on for breakfast tomorrow?" "I'm making blueberry pancakes," Margaret smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it," before setting the phone aside and running her fingers through Sunny's soft fur. The rain fell steadily, but unlike that night a year ago, it didn't feel like sadness washing over her world. It felt like renewal, like the universe gently cleansing away the past to make room for whatever came next. Margaret Foster, no longer the lonely widow of Willow Lane, pulled her loyal companion closer and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Sunny's tail thumped against the wooden porch floor, once, twice, 3 times. The sound blended with the rainfall, creating a rhythm that felt remarkably like hope.